The Prince and Princess designed the garden to be entered through this woodland pathway. The arching sequoia dendron pendulum tree at the beginning of the pathway was added at a later date, probably after the Land Conservancy took over stewardship of the garden. The rhododendrons are well over 100 years old. When the garden was started, they contacted local rhododendron specialists and acquired these amazing plants, which form the foundation of the woodland garden. Rhododendrons have a very compact root ball, so are relatively easy to move. The carpet of flowers underneath are Anemone numerosa and blanda. Other times of the year, cyclamen, epidemium and ferns are spread throughout, along with other shade-loving plants.
Nicholas was born in May 1899 in Georgia, a region on the Black Sea. His family were a line of ancient kings of Abkhazia. His father was a prince and had been a general major in the Tsar's army. In 1917, his father told Nicholas and his mother to go to Paris, where there was already a large community of expatriate Georgians. Nicholas studied law, and he helped to manage a large estate outside Paris. Peggy was born in Shanghai in 1902 to a British architect who was designing a hotel there. In 1907, both her mother and her father died of illnesses. She was briefly looked after by some relatives and then adopted by a wealthy older British couple, the Pembertons, who were friends of her parents. In the 1920s, Peggy and her stepmother were in Paris while she studied classical piano there for a couple of years. In 1922, Peggy and Nicholas were introduced by a friend. Then Peggy and her stepmother kept on traveling around the world. In 1938, Florence Pemberton died, leaving in her estate properties in England, China, and elsewhere. In 1940, Peggy came and visited friends in Victoria and returned to Shanghai in early 1941 because she felt that being a British national, she would be okay even though the war had begun. Meanwhile, Nicholas had enlisted in the French army at the beginning of the war. He was then captured by the Germans and put in a prisoner of war camp near Hanover. But he was let out in 1941, considered to be too old. In April 1943, Peggy was put in an internment camp outside Shanghai.
Some of the most amazing flowers in the garden are these tree peonies, in particular the Princess Abkhazi, which was hybridized by local plantsman and longtime volunteer in the gardens, Joe Harvey. It is a cross between two of the other mature rocky-eye tree peonies. There are usually plants for sale of the Princess Abkhazi here in the gardens, and it is the only place in the world one can acquire one of these really spectacular plants. The next special peony, which is herbaceous, has a rather unpronounceable name, Moikoswichii, of vata pink, but known to most gardeners as Molly the Witch. A rare and hard-to-find plant, beautiful all year. The foliage is a bronze color when it first emerges in the early spring, and the single flowers are a creamy color. Ours is crossed with Ovata pink. In fall, the seed pods split open to display bright pink seeds. These peonies are just two of the many unusual and rare plants in the garden. These commemorative slabs of stone were found in the garden and were mounted here last year, as this is the area that the ashes of Peggy and Nicholas were scattered, also those of their beloved Sheltie dogs. This huge tree is called Abies pinçado, or Spanish fir. It is thought that attempts were made to make it grow across the rocks, but as you can see, it reverted to an upright growth and became a huge tree. These beautiful Japanese maples could also be 100 years old. Two are original plantings, the other two saved and moved here about 10 years ago when a Japanese garden on Douglas Street was to be demolished.
When Peggy got to the internment camp, she hid some American Express traveler's checks in an Elizabeth Arden powder box. And she also began keeping a secret diary. In 1945, when the camp was released, Peggy sailed in October to San Francisco, having cashed in the traveler's checks, and then up to Victoria, where she arrived in December 1945. In January 1946, a letter arrived from Nicholas that had gone around the world since he didn't know where she was. He wrote that he was coming to New York City with the aid of the International Red Cross and would she like to meet him. In March 1946, she bought the property that became the garden for about $1,850. And she had the summer house built shortly thereafter and fencing done around the property. Nicholas arrived in New York City in July 1946, and Peggy went out and met him in September. And they were engaged to be married a few days after she arrived. They had not seen each other since 1933. They were married that November with a reception at the Empress Hotel.
This weeping copper beech tree is a recent planting placed in the garden to commemorate Jack Eldridge, who was a volunteer here and a benefactor to the Land Conservancy. The summer house was the first building on the property, designed by John Wade. It was his first commission, and he later did the house designs. For the time, considered very modern, the style now known as mid-century modern. Good garden designers first observe and study their site and discover its strengths and weaknesses through the first seasons of the garden. The Abkhazis would sit here while planning the garden. They were in rental property at the time, but would bring their sandwiches and oversee work already in progress and work out their ideas. Their concept is considered an excellent example of design for that period, with the concept of garden rooms. Glacial rock formations are the main feature of the site, and the Abkhazis featured them in their plans by building their garden alongside and within the unyielding rock. Every line of the design they created is in harmony with the flow of the rock formations. The lawn was Peggy's idea. She wanted to give the illusion of a flowing river to remind her of the Yangtze River. The border of heathers, which has recently been replanted, was to represent the river bank. As you walk through the garden, you come aware that there are no straight lines anywhere in the garden. On the right side of the heather, deciduous azaleas are growing to the left of the heather border. Nicholas was responsible for the placing of the 3 ponds. He noted large depressions in the rocks where rain naturally gathered, and they became the site of the ponds. The trees above them were chosen for their waterfall-like qualities, such as the Cedrus atlantica glaucus pendulata to the left of the first pond. The huge plant behind this first plant is gunnera. It is native to Brazil and dies down in the winter and needs frost protection, but the leaves can easily grow to 4 feet across each season. The lower pond has turtles living in, and visiting children enjoy spotting our turtles when they climb out to sunbathe on the rocks.
They had an open garden policy starting in 1949 for the public to visit. They had often Negroni cocktails at 11 o'clock in the morning, which are gin, vermouth, and Campari, and they added some Perrier water and had some food so that they would keep energized enough to continue doing work for the rest of the day. They did not have a garage as they had no car. They took Bluebird taxis everywhere. They ate regularly at the Union Club downtown wearing formal dress, and Peggy often had help in the house and best food for entertaining. In the mid-1970s, Maria Serafina Kamara was hired to help with the cooking and cleaning after Nicholas had his first stroke. In 1979, Chris Ball was hired to help in the garden. A couple of years later, Peggy wrote her autobiography, A Curious Cage, with a book signing at the Hudson's Bay Company and the bookshop in Oak Bay. Nicholas died in 1987, so she then made financial agreements with the Balls. Peggy died in 1994, and the mortgage was forgiven in her will. In 1998, the Balls found that the property taxes and the annual cost of maintaining the garden were too much, and they couldn't afford to keep up the property, and they put it up for sale in 1999. They didn't realize the developer was the one who had bought it. The neighbors found out and started a campaign, and they raised enough money over that winter to buy out the developer, and that's when the Land Conservancy took over the property, and it opened to the public in the year 2000.
Hi, my name's Sue Hara. I first heard of the garden in the year 2000 when the big fundraising campaign was in all the papers here in Victoria. But I started volunteering here about 13 years ago. And at the time I had a garden of my own. But for the last 9 years I haven't. So coming here has been a joy, just working in the garden and watching the seasons and the changes. So I work in the garden, and I also work as a docent in the summer. We sit in the summer house and we talk to the visitors, help them with plant identification when possible. But most of all, people like to hear the story because I think they love a beautiful garden, but when they understand that the personal history attached to it and the romantic story, then they really doubly enjoy it.
Margaret Palmer, and I began in 2002. I must have seen an ad in the paper asking for volunteers, and I come on Monday mornings and help weed in the garden, and I come on Thursday afternoons and sit at the gate with another volunteer, and we greet people who come in and steer them in the right direction, and then we try and answer their questions on their way out and try and identify some of the plants they ask about and tell them a bit more of the story if they haven't heard or understood the whole story. And it's very gratifying because, for one thing, there's always lots of weeds to worry about, so you feel quite accomplished when you've done a morning's work. And the people, when they leave, are always happy. They're always grateful that the garden was saved, and they always say how peaceful and calm it is. And that's, of course, what the Abkhazis both felt themselves. So, yeah, it's a nice place to come.